All right, we are recording. So I'll focus on basically communicating how I'm going to assess those three things. And I like to kind of communicate it as if it's not necessarily my data, but this is the process that I use to look at the three things you mentioned, which is overslowing, are you coasting, and braking technique. And the good thing is those are all three pretty easy. I say pretty easy. They're pretty straightforward things to look
Okay.
at once we know what to look at.
Sure.
So that's really the key. And then our goal here is not to leave with a bunch of, oh, we need to do this everywhere, or we need to make all these major changes. It's really just to talk about, reinforcing how to continue measuring those three things. So the next time you're at the track, you can use the same tools that we used in the app to look at those three things and see if you improved. Because that's the biggest thing. We want to try to find a success to boost the confidence level to keep having those successes. And then the other thing is just going to be, a couple of things to work on. So a couple of technique changes to challenge yourself. And we don't want to overload with a whole bunch of different things. We want to really try to stay focused on three, no more than three. And so we'll try to also have a process of, let's say we identify, and we'll have to look at the data before this, but most of us, myself included, are guilty of overslowing corners, especially on occasion, right? So that's none of these problems are isolated. These are all issues that everybody struggles with. So the big thing with that is, if you find you're doing something regularly, not beating yourself up, but being able to look at it as objectively as possible, and also be disciplined enough to only focus on one thing in a session. So if we are saying, okay, we're working on, rolling more speed into the corner, so our brake release, which is most of the time what we need to focus on to not overslow, is that when do we release the brake, and how much. That's one thing to focus on for an entire session, and that's all we need to know. So the goal with data is not necessarily, a lot of people tend to overanalyze it and try to look at too much. And really the goal is that sometimes the most success we can have with data is to notice, oh, hey, we're coasting. We looked at one data point, usually the speed trace. We noticed we're coasting. That's all we have to look at. Now we just got to go fix it. That's when it becomes really powerful, because then it's actionable. If you look at it and you go, I'm coasting, I'm overslowing, my braking technique's a little rough, I'm losing time here every lap, I'm losing time here, I need to be able to carry more G here. If you start doing all that, then it's like, what can I actually do to improve?
Sure.
I don't know. I've looked at too many different things. So we'll start by just sharing the app screen over here. And let me know when you see my iPad appear.
Okay, there it is.
Got it?
Yep.
Awesome. Cool. So obviously and feel free to stop me and ask questions, particularly if it's something in the software that I do that you're unaware of, or just for clarification on anything.
Sure.
But we'll start right here. Just looking for the data. I'd like to organize my data by track first of all. Just, I think it's a cleaner way to look at it. We recently updated this, so the save date is when the data session was actually saved on this device.
Okay.
So you can see yours is right here at the top, because I got it. I've only had 2 other data sessions since I got yours. The run date is going to organize it by the date that you actually originally recorded that data on. So now you'll see it's going to change, based on the date that you actually performed the session.
Right.
And then track obviously organizes it by track. So I'll start by going in to the session here. What's, an important kind of tactic or approach is to set up the data view, I guess, for what you want to initially look at. It usually comes with the stock kind of view is going to be apex score overlaid on the track, and speed trace down here. I like to toggle apex score to longitudinal G because it's easier to look at. I'll go back to apex score to help answer the question, are we overslowing? But for now, I want to look at longitudinal G because it's really easy to see, okay, where am I braking? Where am I accelerating would be green. Where am I braking would be these warmer colors. And then we'll go to our fastest lap. Starting with the fastest lap, we'll toggle through a couple of laps as well to verify different things. Cool. So we've got long G set up here, and then I like to have the speed trace down here. Are you familiar with the
Oh yeah.
trace?
Yep.
Cool. I meant to ask you as well. What do you do? What do you do for work? What's your day job?
I'm a pharmacist with Walgreens.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to work through all this stuff. So
Yeah, I can imagine. Me too. We only have 5 people in our office right now. We have a handful of folks are working from home, and the rest of us are here. So I'm fortunate. I don't have good Wi-Fi at home, so I've got to be here. Cool. So the speed trace is going to be our first kind of macro analysis that I like to look at, just because it's really easy. It's really easy to see. So I'll make an annotation on here, and we'll talk a little bit about Apex score and our lap times in general. But the first thing I'm going to do is, I'm going to change that color, make this a little easier to see. I'm just going to draw a line across the top of the speed trace just to kind of reference what I'm looking for here. What I want to see on these tops of these speed traces here is what we call a sawtooth shape. So I'm looking at the tops of each of these guys.
and they're not real sharp.
They're not real sharp. What we're really wanting to see is something that looks like this. And, the braking part is always going to be steeper than the acceleration part, especially in a car like a BRZ. So we're going to see a more shallow acceleration, but it should be followed by a fairly steep deceleration into most corners. So the very first thing that we're looking at, fast lap selected, is the top of the speed trace. And you assess that correctly. It's probably not sawtooth shaped enough. I can show you some data to reference what I mean. It would be on another track, but we can look at that if that's helpful. And I can certainly send you some data as well. I think the sample data that's in the app has some good sawtooth shapes as well. But that sawtooth shape just represents, and we're looking at right now, this is answering that second question, am I coasting? That sawtooth shape purely just represents wide open throttle to braking, a really quick transition. So the first thing that I would look at before going any further would be, taking some time to intentionally practice your transition from wide open throttle to braking.
Okay.
And basically, this is something I remember struggling with and not fully understanding the consequences of it when I was at my local track's Barber Motorsports Park, and it's a little bit longer than Gingerman. Actually, it's about the same length as Gingerman, maybe. A couple more corners, and lap times are actually fairly similar because the average speed's probably fairly similar. But there's not a lot of hard braking. There's one threshold braking corner. Everywhere else is kind of like Gingerman. You're kind of braking the car just to balance it for the entry speed. It's not throwing the anchor out at every corner. And I was kind of slow with my transition off the throttle onto the brake, so I wasn't going as quickly as I could. I like to think about it like a Formula One driver's got both of their, right foot on the gas, left foot hovering over the brake. And as soon as they release the gas, there's literally zero transition. There might be even a tiny bit of overlap before they're fully off the gas pedal as to when they've applied the brake, because they're trying to minimize any downtime between coasting.
Okay.
And not only that, they're also trying to create, from a physics perspective, you want that weight transition to happen really quickly, because that's going to allow the car to slow very quickly. When we're on the gas pedal, the weight's in the back of the car. If this is the back, rear tires are loaded. If we start to slowly release the gas pedal or coast any, the platform's going to stabilize, right? It's going to level out.
Uh-huh.
So then when you compress those front springs, they actually don't have the same amount of potential to compress. Whereas if they have a bunch of potential energy stored up, the springs are fully decompressed because the weight's over the rear, then you can kind of get the seesaw effect and transition all that weight to the front, and those front springs, boom, they really compress. That forces the tire into the ground and the car slows faster. So transitioning from weight in the rear to weight in the front in a straight line really maximizes the car's potential to slow down. So a lot of times drivers that struggle with that transition don't see the same amount of deceleration when they look at braking forces, at G-forces. Whereas a driver that's going from wide open throttle to braking, they're seeing a higher rate of deceleration. simply because they're taking advantage of the physics. Their pedal input on the brake pedal might be the exact same. Does that make sense? I know that's a lot of
It does.
information.
Mm-hmm.
So to circle back to my story, at a track like Gingerman, having some curvy tops on our speed trace is not going to be a nail in the coffin on lap time. It's definitely going to save some lap time to be able to transition more quickly off the gas onto the brake. In just about every situation, a couple of these corners are places where you're balancing the car, and sometimes coming off the gas if you're turning at the same time can put too much weight on the nose.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be careful to make sure we're analyzing the proper places here. But I would say that, the corners that are leading into, straight braking zones in particular, all these places, those are all the places where you really want to make sure that the speed trace is as sawtooth shaped as possible. So I'll put a little icon, or I'll circle where I see these places. So obviously it's going to be, this is turn 1, which is at the end of the lap because the start finish is right here. This is turn 2, which we're kind of turning as we enter. So we'll leave that one. That's actually a nice sawtooth. Then right here, that's definitely a place where we can work on a quicker transition.
Okay.
And that's one of the better ones. Right here, this guy's, that's not a place where I would say the sawtooth is critical because you're cornering and braking at the same time.
Exactly, yeah.
So that's one of those places where we can give up a little bit there. But right here, that's probably the best sawtooth on the track. We definitely want to make sure that transition is, wide open throttle brake, right? And then the last one that's really important, this one's going to be another balance area. So that guy's going to be another place. So these are the 3 places that I would practice, next time at the track. I'm sorry, 4 places. Turn 1, this is 3, this is, and I'll circle them. Let me get rid of all the graphics here. So we'll do this one, and that is going to be this guy right here. This one, that's going to be this guy right here. This one, that's this guy. And then this one, and that is this guy.
Excellent.
Yeah. So those 4 places, what I would do to help attack this this issue is just every single lap for an entire session. Just don't worry about cornering speeds. Don't worry about overslowing. Don't worry about what gear you're in. Just work on training that muscle memory to go wide open throttle to braking immediately. And as quickly as possible, because the car will slow down at a faster rate, and that'll allow you to incrementally move that braking zone up. And also, we want to make sure we slow the car down in the early part of the brake zone, because that last part of the brake zone, and this is going into the overslowing question, that last part of the brake zone is used for balancing the chassis to carry the right amount of speed through the corner. And that's when we start talking about, how fast is the car going at the slowest part of the corner, minimum corner speed. So this is the first thing that we want to make sure we have. And this coasting, and it's very minimal. You can see these shapes are not super exaggerated. So you're not going and then braking. You're going braking.
Okay.
So what I'm seeing is just a delay. Let's call it a, two tenths of a second, or maybe a tenth of a second delay between releasing the gas pedal and applying the brakes. And I'm willing to bet if you had a camera on your foot, you would just see that tiny little, you're doing this. It's like that.
Okay.
And it needs to be literally as fast as you can possibly go from wide open throttle to braking. Assuming this is a manual transmission car, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I can see the little bump in the speed trace right here. So I assume that is much. So we're going to be obviously right foot braking. And so that means you just got to practice that off and on the brake, off and on the brake. And what happens at first is it's easy to slow the car down too much, because that forceful, that aggressive, if you will, transition, really quick, is going to cause you to initially load the front too much and slow the car down. But it's better than the alternative, and we have to kind of cross that threshold before we can really work on our brake release and our corner entry, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Okay. The last thing I'll talk about on this one is something you can actually do like today, effectively. I don't know, if you guys are in lockdown, you might not be able to drive on the street, but this is something that the reason this is such a common, and this is what the vast majority, 95% of the data that I look at, this is the first thing we talk about, because this is an issue that's created by our street driving habits. And that being that when we go to a stop sign, we don't approach it like we're on the racetrack and go from wide open throttle to maximum brake input as quickly as possible, right? Because we'll spill our coffee and our kids will get mad and wife will slap you and all that kind of stuff. So on the street, we've trained that transition to be pretty slow. It's off the gas, we roll into the brake pedal, and we progressively add brake pedal, adding brake pedal, adding brake pedal, and then the car comes to a stop. So it's literally 180 degrees out. It's opposite of what we do on the racetrack. Because on the racetrack, we go to that initial, maximum brake input first. And that brake input's different for every corner, right? Some corners it's as hard as you can. Sometimes it's a lighter brake. But regardless, we go to that maximum input immediately. And so all that weight goes boom, and the car slows. And then as we get into the corner, we slowly stabilize the chassis with the brake release to prepare the car to accelerate. So it's a totally different approach. So with that in mind, what I find is really, really, really helpful, especially the week leading up to going to the track, is when you're driving in the car by yourself, instead of going to a stop sign and squeezing on the brake pedal, just 30 miles an hour, stop sign, nobody's around or no one's behind you. Ideally, you're pulling up to like an intersection or something, just wait until the very last minute, keep your foot at 10% throttle and go boom on the brake, right? And just transition as quickly as possible. And it doesn't matter how much force you have on either pedal. Just tell yourself, I'm coming off the gas and on the brake as quickly as I possibly can, as quickly as my physical limitations of my leg muscles will allow. And what that does is it calibrates your brain so that when you go to the track, you don't have to do 2 or 3 sessions before, because normally if you don't do that on the road, the first session on the track or the first lap of the session, and we can actually see it if we're looking at your outlap right here. See that big see this big yellow line right here?
Mm-hmm.
That's a coast, right? That's off the gas. Since we're looking at long G, yellow is going to be neutral acceleration. Okay. That's a long period of just coasting, and that's very normal. That's what usually the very first session of the day, most of our braking zones are going to have that coasting moment. But if we calibrate ourselves on the road, any way that we can, and sometimes it's just, thinking about how we apply the brake on the road. And if you're not able to do it like on the track, you can just think kind of out loud or think in your head, like, well, if I was on the track, I would be doing this, as opposed to what you're doing on the road, if that makes sense. Because if you're used to that easing in the brake pedal everywhere on the road, and then you go to the track and you're still doing that, it's hard we can't expect ourselves to just change immediately. Right.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah. That's just a calibration, thing that we can do. So that's the first thing. And that would be the first practice point that I would suggest to remedy any coasting. And like I said, it's not at Gingerman. Fixing this issue in all 4 of these places might be, a handful of tenths total. It's not going to be a huge gain, but it's the first step to bigger gains, because it's proper. We got to get that initial brake technique really good so we can work on our brake release, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah.
Awesome. Cool. So I'll erase all these guys. So we're working on that transition in those 4 places. Cool. So that's number 1. We practice that on the street, and I'll send these points to you in an email afterwards. Let's see. Cool. So that's all. And the reason, and exactly like what you said, the curvy tops on the speed trace were how you noticed that was an issue.
Okay.
So once we looked at the top of the speed trace, The next thing we're going to look at is going to be the bottoms. What does the bottom of our speed trace look like? All these places right here. And the general rule of thumb is the faster the corner, the more of a U shape we want in the bottom of the speed trace. For slower corners, we want more of a V shape in the speed trace. And that V shape is going to mean that, we're braking, we're releasing the brake as the car turns, which would be trail braking. As you add steering input, we're starting to release the brake pedal. And then at the apex of the corner or somewhere about it, you're squeezing back into throttle. And so most of these corners at Gingerman are going to be more of your typical kind of slow speed corners, where you want to see a little bit more of a V shape in the speed trace. So looking at the troughs of all those places I pointed to, we got a couple of good V shapes, and it would be this one right here is a nice V.
Yeah.
And this is a pretty good V because we know that exiting this corner, which would be this area right, these black arrows, this one, are pointing to the same area. Mm-hmm. You're putting the power down here, but you're turning the whole way. So this speed trace is not going to go straight up, right? Because you're turning, so you're probably feeding in the throttle, and you've also got scrub. Even if you are wide open throttle, which you might be in a BRZ, from this point on, mm-hmm. Still turning the wheel. So you got your rudder turned, you can't go, the car's not going to accelerate at full speed. So let me add some different color here. So I think the good example corners are this one where the blue arrows are, and this one. These other places where the black arrows are, that's a little too much of a U shape, meaning that there's probably some time in the middle of the corner where we're either not on either pedal, or we're going back to throttle too soon, but only able to add a little bit. Does that sound familiar?
Yep, definitely.
So we've already talked about the initial brake application. The biggest thing with getting out of the corner that I usually see, and I think what we see going on here is, as drivers, we tend to, when we know we've overslown, or we know the car can do more, instead of looking at it from the proper physics perspective, which takes a lot of time and understanding and thoughtfulness to create, which is hard initial brake, smooth release, we tend to get out of the brake pedal too soon, know that we've gone too slow for the corner, and go straight back to the gas pedal. And a lot of times that's just a little bit of gas pedal, but what that creates in the speed trace is the U shape in these slow speed corners. Which means, like right here, let's look at this corner in particular. Even though this was a pretty good behavior corner, what we want to look for here is, where are we getting on the throttle? And if you use the longitudinal G channel, green coloring is going to represent forward acceleration. Okay. So that means when we see green, we're on the throttle. For a corner like this, where our, it's pretty tight, it's pretty slow speed, around 40, a little over 40 miles per hour, I would say this blue arrow is pointing to you being on the throttle maybe a little sooner than we need to be, which sounds kind of, backwards. I'd want to be on the throttle soon, right, to cover distance and accelerate out of the corner. But what that usually means is that the car doesn't need to slow down that much for the corner, and you could capitalize on rolling more speed through the corner.
Okay, that's exactly what I wanted to know.
Yep. So that's one way that I'm identifying that. I'm going to erase all these arrows down here, and I'm going to go to an even. So basically, if you see U shapes in the speed trace like this, mm-hmm. in slow speed corners, that means that you probably are doing all your braking in a straight line and releasing that brake pedal, and the weight's going too far back too soon, and then you're adding a little bit of throttle at a time, just a little bit. So the question that I'll leave you with here, before we go to show this same thing on another screen, is get to wide open throttle as soon as possible, not any throttle. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So our goal is going to be, and that applies everywhere, wide open throttle, not any throttle. So basically, as you're driving, the way that I practice this is I try to find when I'm at 10% throttle, at some point in the corner. If I'm right here at 10% throttle and then I have to release back to 5% throttle to help the car to turn, I'm asking myself, what if I just waited and didn't apply that 10% throttle right here, and I waited until right here, and then I applied it all at once? How would that affect the balance of the car and my acceleration out of the corner? And 9 times out of 10, it has a positive effect, especially out of slow corners. And it sounds backwards, but the problem that we're combating here has to do with corner entry speed. We have to have the right blend between entry speed and exit speed, even in a slow corner. So you asked the question, am I overslowing? So that the first evidence I have is those U shapes, but that's not conclusive, because you could still be at the limit of the tire, for all I know, unless I go watch the apex lights all the way around the track, which I've already done, and we can do that as well. But what I like to look at is what the apex lights represent, which is this guy. And to get there, I just toggled over on this arrow on the bottom
Right.
screen here. Are you familiar with the friction circle at all?
Yes, I watched your video.
Oh, cool. Perfect. So what I like to do with the friction circle to answer the question, is there more speed in the corner, is I grab the little slider down here and I move it through the lap. And I'm basically looking for, where is the dot on the friction circle when I'm in the corner. So right here, this is this guy right here. This is our track position. And this is where we are on the friction circle. Go back to black here. So you can see that dot's very close to the outside edge of the friction circle. We're at -1 lateral G here and 0.1 positive G. So you're at maximum cornering basically, and you're accelerating slightly. So at this point, and we can also see almost all green lights on the device. We got one little green light, one little red light, which is showing us there's a tiny bit left. So what I would immediately say from looking at the friction circle there, with that dot that close to the outside edge, I would say you're doing good right here as far as using all the tire's grip. So I wouldn't be concerned about this corner. And then we're just going to do this, work our way around the entire lap. So then we will drag the dot forward, and we're going to look at our braking tendency for this guy right here. So braking is going to be down at the bottom of the friction circle. We can see right here we're at -0.88 longitudinal G, and we've got all green lights on the display. So right now you're braking probably at the car's peak deceleration rate for this particular corner. And 0.9 is probably pretty close for a heat cycled RE71. 0.9 negative longitudinal G. Most cars RE71s will do -1.2 or so in a threshold brake, as hard as you can type of corner. So that's something to keep in mind, in the future. But like you said, with really worn RE71s, they kind of behave like race tires. They tend to fall off once they have been used, for several heat cycles. I'm willing to bet your whole friction circle would be a little bigger with your new RE71s. You probably see 1.2 lateral G, and you probably see 1.2 negative.
Well, I'll probably look at, I got some data from NCM with the new tires. I'll look at that and see if I can see that.
Yeah. And if you're not seeing -1.2 down here, longitudinal G, then that probably means there's more braking potential, or potentially the ABS is intervening, and you can do something to kind of work around the ABS. In my experience, BRZs are pretty capable in decel. It's pretty capable. The ABS isn't too bad. The only one that I've driven had RS4s on it, Hankook RS4s. So it wouldn't decelerate as quickly as a car with RE71s. They're a lot stickier. So you're probably looking at -1 to -1.2 for maximum longitudinal deceleration. So let's keep. I'm gonna actually hit the play button right here. And what we're looking for the progression of the corner is making sure that this dot tracks along the outside edge, which for this particular corner, it does.
Yep, I can see that.
Yep. So these first two corners, I think, are probably your strongest places on the track, basically, that I've looked at so far, because you get to wide open throttle about right here, and you don't have to release the throttle at all. And then also you can the dot tracks right along the outside edge. See how those dots are further out than any of the other ones?
Mm-hmm.
So that's telling me right there that that's the only corner like this where you're actually plotting these dots along the very outside edge. So that probably means there's some opportunity in other places. So let's look at a couple of the more technical corners, because you mentioned this, and this is the turn 5 complex right here, right? This is 4.
Yep.
And then now we're going to be decelerating, and this is turn 5. So right here, you see the dots kind of in the middle of the friction circle.
Yes.
We really don't want that. We want to minimize that as much as possible, having the dot anywhere in this inside edge.
Okay.
So what that means for this area, and what's probably happening right here, and I'm going to tap where the dot is on the lap. See that? And to do that, I just tapped the lap.
Mm-hmm.
So let's remember up here, we're looking at longitudinal G. So what's that telling us? Negative 0.04.
That I don't have forward I'm not accelerating forward.
Yep, you're decelerating very, very minorly.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably, in my experience, anything under about negative 0.1, any value lower, closer to 0 than that is going to be coasting. So off the gas and no brake input. That's usually, with a drivetrain, slowing the car down, and then aero drag at 84 miles an hour is pretty considerable. So the car's going to decelerate slightly when we're off the gas. So basically right here, you're releasing that gas pedal, and that's what's putting the dot in the middle of the friction circle. And also what's really important to reference here for the real-time component is what you see on the lights. So the lights, the best way to think about it is if you understand that friction circle really well, that's essentially what the Apex Pro is showing you, saying, hey, we're not on the edge of the friction circle here. So that's going to be the first clue as to we can carry more cornering speed here, or we can carry more speed. So I would say at this point on the track, you could probably still be accelerating at wide open throttle, or you could at least be, at some throttle. And this is a tricky complex of corners, but the other thing I'm looking at here is you brake here, evidenced by the orange. Then there's an acceleration right here. See that green?
Yep.
And then more deceleration here. So what I would aim to do with this whole section is change your approach so that you could basically accelerate for longer and then brake once through this whole part of the corner and make this whole thing orange, this whole color orange right here.
Okay, brake once.
Yep, brake once. Does that help? I know this was a place you specifically said you wanted to look at.
Mm-hmm. No, that gives me something to work on and try. So I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think, and to summarize it just really simply, this corner right here should be taken as an early apex. Right now, your turn in is fairly late as far as, the approach of the corner. So you're kind of, what autocrossers would call squaring it off or getting on the backside of the corner. It's a late apex that, based on the trajectory of the GPS image, I'll move it around here so it looks like we're approaching it. So your turn in starts, let's call it, we'll get rid of all these other arrows, starts right here. It's not a super, super late turn in, but I think you could actually bend in the car, start turning your hands very slightly sooner. And the reason that we want to do that is because we want to get rid of this little acceleration point.
Mm-hmm.
So don't apply the brakes. You're going to brakes about right here. I think if you could hold out and turn in earlier with really minor steering input, then you could brake. You could decelerate all the way through here, and then you're going back to the gas here. So basically, you're just braking once instead of this brake, accelerate, brake. And what that'll do for us is, one, it'll allow you to gain lap. You'll go fast. The lap has the potential to be faster because you're accelerating for longer here. So you're traveling at a higher distance for a higher speed for a longer distance. But and the second point is that you'll be able to maintain this dot on the outside of the friction circle all the way through the corner. So basically you're carrying a higher speed for longer here, and then you'll actually carry more speed through the corner, which, because this is a long radius, big, long corner, we want to roll as much speed through the corner as possible. We can't just park it. It's not just like a point and shoot, 180-degree corner, since the car's turning this whole way, right? We've got to maximize our rolling speed. I'm willing to bet that this corner is where the really fast guys at Gingerman would pull a big gap on the guys that aren't as fast, because this is pretty technical. This is trying to think of somewhere similar to this. Kind of the entry to turn 10 at NCM might be similar. So think about that. That's a really, really tight corner. It's that second gear corner. But I think the approach is the same. You're approaching probably at a very similar speed. You're probably doing a downshift at some point in there. And the general kind of trajectory is similar. So that corner at NCM, right, we only brake once, right? We come in, put the weight on the nose, and then we transition through that really, really tight corner.
Yes.
Try the same approach here.
Okay. That's good advice.
Yeah. And to help measure what we've talked about, I would just take the slider, move it to this point on the track, and make sure you can see how that dot's in the middle of the friction circle right there. It's nowhere near the very bottom or the outside. It's kind of hibernating in the middle, and then we're a little bit on the outside. And then as we get a lot of lateral G, we're on the outside here. What we really want to see is that dot, when you brake, go down here. And then as you go through the corner, you want to see its path just slowly move out to here and then back up here. I find that to be the best way to look through there. The other way to tell if you're improving through here is watching the apex lights, or noticing them. See how we're braking right here? And you've got a whole bunch of red lights right here. If you're turning in early and braking pretty light and carrying more speed through here, I think you'll see more green lights throughout the corner. That's a good measurement tactic as well. Okay,
that's good stuff to look at.
Yeah. So that kills two birds with one stone there, talking about turn 5 and looking at, I think that's probably the biggest opportunity for rolling speed as far as carrying more speed in the corner goes. Great. So we talked about overslowing and coasting, and then the last thing you wanted to touch was braking technique. And we talked a little bit about braking technique with the initial brake application. And that makes sense, right? Got a clear understanding of what you want to try there, that transition.
Yes.
Awesome. And we're going to practice that on the road. That's an easy thing. So the second component that's really important with braking is the release. Arguably the most important part of the braking process is the release. But in order to focus on our brake release, we have to understand and we have to focus on that initial application of the brake pedal. So we'll rehash that real quick, because I want to just make sure, because this is something that I've had to really think about in different ways to get through my mind. But let's take this corner, for example, or even this corner we just talked about, turn 5. You're not braking as hard as you can there, right? Even if let's say you're at track record pace for your car, whatever that would be, right? I don't know, but you're not going to be braking at the car's potential, because you're cornering here, right, the whole way. So you can't brake at the car's potential because there's some lateral load. And same thing here, because it's not going to be you're not going to be approaching at a high enough speed to have to brake as hard as possible, because you're just going to probably end up overslowing the corner, right? So your approach here, I think, is really good. So the first thing that we have to address is, when we talk about that transition from wide open throttle to braking, we get to our maximum brake input for the corner as quickly as possible. And I think I said this before, that brake input is not always maximum brake input, though. And that's where it gets really tricky. It's pretty simple to go, okay, transition as quickly as possible. All right, leave as little time on the table. Duh, easy. Right? The hard part is transitioning to the right amount of brake as quickly as possible. And also respecting the car and the tire and everything, right? With your car, you can be pretty aggressive with an RE71, because that's a really sticky tire. But if you have, stock suspension, or, kind of lazy suspension, sometimes attacking the brake pedal too aggressively is just going to cause the ABS to intervene. The chassis is not going to respond the right way. You've got to kind of take into account, what you're driving in order to maximize it. In a true race car with really stiff shocks and springs, it's as quick as you can, right? And you're hard on that brake pedal, hard, especially like an open wheel car, or a formula car, or a prototype car. They're using, 800 or 900 pounds per square inch of force on the brake pedal. I mean, just imagine just kicking something as hard as you can. That's how hard they're able to hit the brake pedal. But on a street car, we can't be that aggressive. Mm-hmm. We're still going to be pretty aggressive, but we can't be that aggressive. So that's the first thing. Does that make sense? We're not always braking at threshold, essentially. And I think that's something you understand really well based on the data. But I think it's important to cover so we're on the same page. The biggest opportunity for almost all drivers is halfway through the braking zone, so while the car's still slowing down, to the apex. And so the goal is, how do I carry as much speed as possible from that part of the braking zone, that middle part of the braking zone, to the apex of the corner?
Yes.
That's where it all is, right? That's once we get, past the fundamental novice levels of driving and we have a pretty good, corner exit's pretty intuitive, and your corner exit looks really good, right? In general, once you go to the throttle, you're squeezing to wide open throttle. In a couple places, you might be going to the throttle a little too early, and you're just progressively adding it based on those U shapes on the speed trace. But your throttle application technique it looks good. So I think the biggest fish to fry is let's try to roll 1 to 2 more miles per hour into the corner and still be able to clip the apex, have the tires right where you want them, and then accelerate and get to wide open throttle sooner. If we do those two things, roll a couple more miles per hour into the corner without compromising where we want to place the car, and then getting to throttle a little sooner, that's what's going to create really big lap time gains. So we'll be practicing that initial brake application on the road. So how do we practice the release? And tell me a little bit about, and maybe you explain to me what you've been taught as far as brake release goes, especially if you're working with NASA Great Lakes guys, you're attending their events. I'm sure there's some really good content in the classroom, but tell me a little bit about what you understand about releasing the brake pedal. Maybe just talk about what you've learned with the brake release, I guess.
Okay. Well, like I said, running an HPDE2, so they want us to do all our braking in a straight line. They don't have us doing any trail braking or anything in that group. So basically, we're taught to, apply a maximum brake pressure and then let off, at a slower rate, is kind of how we're taught.
Is it fair to say the initial application of the brakes is more assertive than the release of the brakes?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So and we won't talk too much about trail braking, or that's a term that can be kind of confusing because it sounds very active, but in reality, it's just releasing the brake pedal. So the way I like to think about it is, you've got 100% of the tire's capability. Let's say the tire can do 100%, right? All green lights is 100%. All green lights right here is 100%. So if you're braking in a straight line, you can go from wide open throttle and you can pound that brake pedal through the floorboard. As long as your hands are straight and you're not turning, you can use 100% of the car's braking ability. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What happens to that 100% as we start to add some of that percentage to steering? Let's say now we're turning and 20% of the car's grip is now committed to lateral load or cornering. Can we still be at 100% on the brake pedal?
No.
Exactly. Nailed it. You got to come back to 80%, right? And then as you add more steering, now we're at 50% lateral load, 50% decel. We've got to be at 50%. So it's a give and take. Anytime we start using that steering wheel, that's an indication that we can no longer be at that threshold hard braking occurrence. So that's the way I think about it, not necessarily as trail braking. So as we're turning right here in turn 5, you're going around the corner, you're adding left-hand lock, and you're still slowing down. Let's say this is 50% of the tires committed to cornering. You can probably only be at 50% on the brakes, right? So that's a 5 out of 10 of brake force maximum. But what also comes into play there is the surface and the cambering, the cresting, the grip changes on the track. And a lot of times in most corners like that, where we have some polished pavement or surface changes, that's going to reduce the braking capability more. So maybe we're only at 40% braking. So I like to think about it from that 100% perspective, right? I can only do so much, right? Right here, I can brake hard when I'm in a straight line, but as soon as I turn the wheel, I need to be releasing the brake pedal. So the biggest thing to going from where you are now, which is mostly braking in a straight line, to braking, to releasing the brake as you turn, is the same exact thing we talked about before with that practice on the road. Is basically while you're driving the car on the road, think about where your end of braking is for every corner that you take. Especially leading up to a track event, a month ahead of time. But even today, if you have to go run an errand or something, let's say you're taking like a 90-degree corner in a neighborhood. You don't necessarily have to clip the apex, because sometimes that can be irresponsible and cut through somebody's yard or whatever. But I like to go, okay, if the apex is, approximately where that sidewalk is right there, and maybe the end of that little, drainage curb or whatever, and it's a tight 90-degree corner, I want to be completely off the brake pedal right at the apex and going to throttle, right? That's kind of my indication. So you need to brake in a straight line, and then as you start turning the wheel, proportionately release your brake pedal, right? So think about it like there's a string tied to the steering and the brake, right? The bottom of the steering wheel's got a string that's tied to that brake pedal, and it's only long enough to allow you to brake at 100% braking, right, in a straight line. Okay. You're at maximum braking, and as you turn the wheel, that string is going to move from down here to up here. So it's increasing the distance, and if you just turn that wheel and you still have your foot all the way on the brake pedal, it's going to snap the string, right? And that means you broke the edge of traction, right? You overloaded the tire. So what we're going to have to do is turn that wheel and then release the brake pedal at a proportionate rate, or ideally a little bit quicker than proportionate, because we want to allow for some error. So that's how I practice what I call the EOB, adopted from Ross Bentley, end of braking, is instead of thinking about braking as my brake point, where do I apply the brakes, it's important to work backwards. Where do I want to release the brake pedal? Okay. Is kind of the first thing that we need to think about. And then it's, where do I accelerate to on the straightaway? Not where do I start braking? How far can I carry wide open throttle? If we're operating under the assumption we're transitioning off the gas, on the brake as quickly as possible, then that end of acceleration point is really important. Instead of going down the front straightaway here at Gingerman and going, I'm going to brake right here, I would rather go, I'm going to accelerate to right here. All right. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm going to carry wide open throttle to that point on the track. And it's a very specific thing. I'm going to carry wide open throttle to the 3 brake marker. That means you're probably braking somewhere around the 2.5, right? Because the car is going to, cover some ground. Even if your transition is immaculate, the car is still going to cover some ground in that time. So end of acceleration point, end of braking point. Those are the 2 things we wanted to be very specific with defining for our braking technique. So those are the 2 things I would work on and does that make sense? Basically, every time you're in the car, if you can train your mind to go, every time I turn the wheel, if I'm still on the brakes, I have to release the brakes. Even if you don't have to on the road, unless it's raining and you're going down a hill and turning, but I think about it a lot of times because, I think the last time I was driving through, I live in Birmingham, Alabama, and I was driving through town to go visit some relatives, and it was really wet. It had just started raining. It went from dry conditions to wet conditions pretty quickly. And where the pavement turns from asphalt to concrete, usually concrete's a little bit more slippery in the wet. And every exit ramp that was concrete that I passed for like 3 or 4 miles, somebody had run off the edge of the exit ramp and hit the guardrail.
Wow.
It was 3 in a row, I think, and they all made the exact same mistake. And that was, first of all, they were entering the corner at they're entering the corner at their dry, cornering speed, right, instead of their wet cornering speed. And then they tried to brake and turn at the same time and overloaded the tire, right, instead of braking initially and then releasing the brake to put some weight on the rear as they're getting into the corner to use all 4 contact patches. They were just using the front contact patches, and they're turning the wheel and they're still on the brake and they're adding brakes, and the ABS is going, whoa, 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 whoa. And it's pulsing, and the tire just slides straight off the road, right? That's the most common mistake that people make. And it's because they weren't braking down here when they started initially braking. They were barely braking at all. And then they started braking more as they started having lateral force. And now they're trying to put the dot right here, which it can't be right there. It's not possible. And that's why people end up doing that in the wet. And it was exactly the same problem for 3 different people. And I remember thinking, I don't know how we teach people this, but you have to slow down more initially and release the brake as you turn, right? If the ABS intervenes, you just slightly release that brake pedal. All right, everything is fixed. That's the same exact principle that we use on the racetrack. We're just, because it's, we're talking about dry conditions with sticky tires, it all happens really, really quick. So there's always, this is stuff we can practice on the skid pad, or if you have like the stock wheels and tires for your car, it's never a bad idea to take those to an event and just run the all season street tires, and it really forces you to have that like delicate brake release because there's so little grip available. You can't, RE71s are really sticky. So you can conceivably brake and corner pretty aggressively. And if our mental aptitude and our, response and preparation for that amount of grip isn't there yet, sometimes that can help us can push us further away from the proper technique. That's why you see a lot of guys with really fast cars, really high grip, that just can't carry cornering speed because they never were forced with a lower grip, tire or car. They were never forced to have the proper technique. So when they add speed, it doesn't necessarily get better.
Okay.
So that's just a thought. Does that make sense? I know that's a pretty deep.
No, it makes sense.
Yeah. Cool. Do you have any questions about that into braking? I can summarize it a little bit more succinctly, and basically it's define an exact point on the racetrack. Let's go into turn 5 right here. And if you're into brake points somewhere, in this area, maybe there's a spot on the curb or something like that, and you're going, that's where I want to be completely off the brake pedal. That's into braking. And that means that we're releasing the brake pedal progressively all the way through the corner, because we can't add brake pedal when the corner gets tighter right here, right? That's going to overload the front tires. Mm-hmm. We're releasing the brake pedal all the way through here, and we're off the brakes, and now we're on the gas. That's all into braking is. Define that exact point where you want to be off the brakes. So I think we've got 3 different intentional practice things here, and the first one's going to be coasting into braking zones. And when I say coasting, like I said, you're very minorly coasting. It's really just intentionally going as quickly from wide open throttle to braking as possible, as quickly as possible, and practicing that on the road a little bit. So that's the first one, practicing that entry. And then I think the second thing is just practicing that slow release of the brake pedal. And like you said, in HPDE2, it's going to be mostly focused on straight line braking, but they are probably using some verbiage from the beginning that's implying this is something that we're going to learn later, which is releasing the brake as you get into the corner. Mm-hmm. So the first things that I would look at when you go back to the track, and maybe look at some data from your newer tires as well to see how many G's you're pulling and stuff like that, so you have a reference. But the first thing that I would look at is just pull up this, click your fastest lap over here, and then look at the top of that speed trace and ask yourself, does it look like a sawtooth? Does it look like this right here? Boom, boom. And if the answer is no, then that's all you need to worry about. That's all you need to practice. How do I get it to look like that? Does that make sense?
Yes, very much so.
Awesome. The second thing is, do my slow speed corners have U's in the trough of the speed trace? A couple of these do. And so the question there is, where is my end of break point? So I'll summarize this in an email, but speed trace is going to be sawtooth. And then the second thing is going to be rolling speed, U's in slow corners equal over slow. And so if you find that you do have these U's persisting in these slower corners, the question to ask yourself is, where am I trying to be off the brake pedal? Where am I trying to release the brake pedal? And that might be something you can ask people too. You know, a really good question to ask a really competent driver is, hey, where do you release the brake pedal? Do you have a reference for that? Or can you walk me through where you get off the brake pedal for this corner? The rule of thumb for brake release for end of brake points is the faster the corner, the sooner in the corner you release the brake pedal, if that makes sense. So let's maybe turn 5 at NCM, that really, really fast right-hander, familiar with that corner. You don't want to release the brake pedal deep into the corner there, right? Because you're going really fast. You basically brake in a straight line and add throttle as you turn in there. Because it's close to 100 mile per hour corner in a lot of cars. Spec 944 can almost maintain 100 miles per hour through that corner. But somewhere like, turn 3 right here, this is a really slow speed, exit focused corner. And the slower the corner, the deeper in the corner our brake release is. So the closer to the apex we release the brake. So I'll summarize that as well. So slow corners, end of brake equals close to apex. Fast corners, end of brake equals closer to turn in. So basically, the faster the corner is, the earlier in the progression of the corner you release the brake pedal. And that makes a lot of sense when you go into turn 5 and you carry a bunch of brake pedal in and you go, whoa, that was sketchy, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't because you carried too much speed. It was because you released the brake too late, and that put all that weight on the nose, and that rear end goes, whoop, right? Wants to be in the front. Awesome. Do you have any questions to pose before we wrap up here?
No, I appreciate everything. Gave me a lot to think about and stuff to work on. So I think should help quite a bit.
Awesome. Well, if you don't mind, just give me one tidbit that you're gonna try to implement as soon as possible, whether it's practicing on the street or at the track. And then
I'm definitely going to work on the throttle to brake, timing. That's easy, and then probably like you mentioned, looking at corners and end of braking, that type of thing.
Gotcha. Cool. So practicing that transition, wide open throttle to braking, little time in between those two as possible. And then where is my end of brake?
Yep.
Yeah. And that's just asking yourself that question. Cool. That sounds great. And if you get more data, especially if it's at Gingerman again, and you want to do one of these sessions, let me know. We've got the live sessions $199, but we've got discounts for Lap Timer Plus subscribers if you use the Lap Timer Plus feature.
I haven't yet, but I'm going to upgrade when I get closer to getting on the track, because I got to get a new phone and stuff. So
yeah,
that's in my plans.
Cool. Well, we've got a couple of resources that show you, what all the functionality is, but the biggest thing that's helpful, makes it very easy to understand, is the theoretical lap time. So basically the Lap Timer Plus breaks the track into different sectors. And then it adds up the times for each sector throughout the session. And then at the end, it puts all the best sectors together, and it goes, if you did all the best sectors from different laps, this is what your lap time would be. And it's usually about a second, maybe a little more faster than the current time. Like, I think I was looking at your theoretical on here, because I've got Lap Timer Plus on this, and it was going to go one more screen. Yeah, it's about half a second faster than your best lap time.
Okay.
Theoretical time. And a lot of times what theoretical indicates too is if our theoretical is not much faster than our best time, sometimes that means we need to be a little more experimental with trying different things. And that'll create different, one time just totally don't worry about corner exit and just focus on carrying a lot of speed on the entry, or vice versa. And that'll create, sectors that are really fast on certain laps. And all of a sudden that'll show your theoretical as being really fast. And then usually you can get about half, say your theoretical is a second faster than your best lap. Usually you can get about half of that.
Cool.
So that's a really nice measure to have. But yeah, once you do that, definitely reach back out, because I find these sessions are the most, usually after about 2 or 3, we can have enough exchange of information that you can implement self-coaching. And, I tell people, like, if we're having to do these once a week, then I'm not doing my job. My goal is not to just have you send your data every single time and me babysit through it. I want to go, okay, here's what I use in the data to learn this, and then you can kind of self-coach. So it's more of an investment in the learning process than it is just a product, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I definitely want to do it again.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I will. I'll send you a follow-up email with the recording, and it'll just be like an unlisted YouTube link. And if you don't mind, I might use this on our website as like what the sample session looks like.
Sure. That's fine.
Awesome.